Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience in waiting for us tonight. Thank you for that amazing welcome for a man who, as it transpires, really does need no introduction. I'm going to go ahead and say it, one of my favorite authors, one of the great American authors.
Well, thank you.
One of the great fantasy, history, horror, you name the genre, he's done it. He's mastered in this book, Fire and Blood, the narrative, non-fiction history form, which is infuriating for me because I've based my entire career on doing that. Cast your mind back, if you will, a quarter of a century now, I suppose. Take us back to the origins of when you started thinking about Westeros. I mean, did you expect that it would end up with awards and multi-million sales all over the world?
No. No, and for a long time it didn't look as though it would. It's when I speak to young writers, and I'm sure there are some people in this auditorium who dream of writing themselves. Some of you probably are writing yourselves, maybe even submitting your stories and novels. I always stress what an uncertain profession it is. I mean, if you're someone who needs security, don't become a writer. It's a profession for gamblers. You can be very hot one minute, and the next minute your publisher has dropped you and your agent isn't returning your calls. And all you can do, I think, and what I've always tried to do throughout my career is write the best book you can and turn it over to your agent and your publisher. Hope they do a good job of getting it out, and hope that the audience finds it and likes it. Game of Thrones came along after I'd already been in the business for quite some time. I sold my first story in 1971. I didn't start writing Game of Thrones until 1991, so I was already 20 years in as a writer, a novelist, also a television writer, producer. And it came out in 96. Publishers paid me quite a substantial sum of money for it. Especially, thankfully, my British publishers. But then when it first came out, it did not set the world on fire. It did okay, but it wasn't the breakthrough bestseller that people thought it would be. But it built, and that's promotion is great, advertising is great. You need all of those to really help launch a book. But the best is word of mouth. And when the people who had read the first book told their friends about it, and those friends told other friends, and people started discussing it online and the primitive version of the internet that existed back then. And finally, when the second book came out, it did better than the first one. And that was the first book of mine to hit any bestseller list, not necessarily the Nielsen list, which I'm sure I didn't touch in 1996 or 1999. But we were on the New York Times bestseller list with the second book. We were on in number 13 for 1 week, and then we were off the list. But the third book did better than that. The fourth book debuted at number 1 on the New York Times list and stayed there for a while. And, then the TV show came along, and after that, I kind of moved into the bestseller list permanently and built a nice guest house there. And so it's really, I think, fans telling other fans and people sharing that builds up the momentum. But I had no idea that it would ever be this big. I hoped that the books would be well received, that they would sell well enough for me to continue to write them, and that people would like them. And thankfully, they have.
Now, as you said, by that point, you'd written extensively in science fiction genre, you'd written some horror, if you think about Fever Dream, you'd worked in television as a writer and a producer. Where did this world come from? I was reading a letter by Tolkien this week, which he wrote in the 1950s about his fantasy world of elves and hobbits and so on. And Tolkien said in the letter, "This stuff began with me. I mean, I do not remember a time when I was not building it. I've been at it since I could write." I mean, was that your experience with this material? Had you been percolating it for years, or did it come to you in a sort of flash? What was the process?
I published my first novel in 1977, science fiction novel, Dying in Light. And I had published 4 novels. Three of them had done increasingly well. The 4th novel, The Armageddon Rag, although it got me quite a substantial advance, was a commercial failure. So I had to go out in Hollywood for 10 years. I did not have any immediate script assignments in television or film. So I thought, well, okay, it's been a few years since I wrote a novel. I will begin one. And I started writing a science fiction novel called Avalon, which was part of my Thousand Worlds future history that I'd written a lot of stories about in the 70s. And it was going well. I'd been thinking about that one, percolating that one for some years. But then one day, suddenly this chapter came to me, almost like preformed in my head, and it was the chapter where Bran finds the direwolf pups in the summer snow. And it came to me so vividly that I knew I had to write it. So I put Avalon aside, I put it back in a drawer, and I sat down to write this chapter. I didn't know what it was part of. Was it a standalone short story? Was it part of a book? By the time I finished that chapter, and it only took me 2 or 3 days, I already knew what the next chapter had to be. So I went on, I wrote that, and I wrote the one after that, and so it all started building for me in the summer of 1991, and I think I wrote about 100 pages that summer. And then Hollywood kicked up again. Suddenly my agent sold a television pilot for me, so I put Game of Thrones in the drawer as well, and went out and did a pilot, and then I did some backup scripts for the pilot, and then I did another pilot. I wrote a feature film. None of them ever got made. It was like 3 years until I returned to Game of Thrones. But when I did, it was like I'd put it down yesterday, which was huge for me, because from periodically I take out those pages of Avalon that I also put aside in 91, and they're ice cold. I have no idea where I was going or what I was doing. It's all faded away, but it did not do that on Game of Thrones. The book had such a claws in me, so deep, the characters. I guess I'd been thinking about them in the back of my head all those intervening years where I'd been doing other stuff. So I got right back into it in 93 and 94, and then we sold it, and the rest is imaginary history.
And so is that where it starts for you, with the characters first and then you build the world around them? Did it start with the Starks in this case?
In that case, it started with a scene. And as I wrote the scene, I learned who the character. I knew. It's hard to remember now after all these years, something like almost 30 years. But I knew the protagonist of that scene had to be a young boy who wouldn't really quite understand everything that was going on, and I knew he was part of a large family. I knew I wanted the direwolf pups found. I wanted the found in the summer snow. That phrase was there right from the beginning. I don't know where it came from, but I knew that it was the summer snows, and that put me on a line to the unsteadiness of the seasons. And there's something wrong in this world with our normal seasons, that you're getting snow in the middle of summer. I've often said that there are two types of writers, two archetypes, if you will, the architect and the gardener. And the architect writes books the way an architect plans a house. An architect knows how many rooms there are going to be, and what the roof is going to be like, and where the plumbing goes, and where the bathrooms are, and how is it heated? Is it forced air heated? Is it baseboard heated? Is it electrical? He knows everything. It's all there on blueprints, all planned before a single board is purchased or a single nail is driven. The gardener digs a hole in the ground and throws in a seed and waters it, and he hopes something comes up. Now, he knows generally what's going to come up. He knows whether he planted an acorn for an oak tree or a tomato plant to get some tomatoes for the summer, but there's a lot of details he doesn't know. It may not grow at all. It may grow a little and then die. It may, go wild. The chipmunk may eat it during the night. You don't know. Obviously, I don't think any writer is 100% architect or 100% gardener, but I'm at least 97% gardener. And in that, I think I have that in common with Tolkien. When he set out to write Lord of the Rings, it was supposed to be a sequel to The Hobbit. Well, let's have another Hobbit story, another little adventure of the Hobbits, like the one you did with Bilbo. And he said the tale grew in the telling, and indeed it did. It grew to something much bigger than he thought when he started out, and mine has done that same thing.
Going back to A Game of Thrones, when you read those first chapters that you've described writing in the early 90s there, I was very struck with how much of the history of this world you seemed to have already written. Things that are recounted in greater depth and detail in Fire and Blood seemed, Aegon's conquest, the beginning. How did this world come about? What were its major political turning points? And that's reflected, it seems to me, as a reader, through, even when I read the early Duncan Egg stuff, the Hedge Knight. Again, we've got this really strong sense of the history of the realm, of the Blackfyre Rebellion sort of hanging in the background. How much of that history did you have to map as you went along in order to fill out the world?
Well, I knew none of it when I began. It's been a simultaneous process. I wrote that first chapter, and names came to me and all that. I had some vague sense, and then when I wrote the second chapter, the king is coming. Where is he coming from? At some point in that process, I said, I better have a map. So I got out a piece of typing paper, and initially I found a map of Ireland and turned it upside down and put that in. But I said, well, I don't want it to be too visible, so I'll change some of it. And then I said, I can't fit it all on this map, so I'll need another piece of typing paper. So you got the south on one piece and the north on the other. And I gradually filled them in as I went and all that. And it was the same with the kings. People would occasionally mention the king or the old king and Aegon the Conqueror, and I better sit down at some point and figure out who these kings are. So I won't contradict and I made up a list of however many Targaryen kings there are and dates for them and trying to vary them. And at first it was just a list of names, but as I got deeper into it, even as I'm writing about the present day characters, the past characters, the background characters are achieving more and more reality in my head. And the world got progressively more complicated.
We've had some questions which I'm going to feed in throughout this conversation, and one of them these are from some of them from people in the audience, some of them are from social media followers, and one of them sort of pertains to what you're talking about. This is a question from Adrienne Modolo, who says, how is your workspace organized to write a Song of Ice and Fire? Do you have a corkboard like in police investigations, where you've noted all the Targaryens and all the Freys, says Adrian. Give us a physical sense of how you write and where you write.
Well, I don't have a corkboard. I have maps now, because there's been a beautiful map book called The Lands of Ice and Fire. So I printed out those large-scale maps, and I keep them around me so I can refer to the maps from time to time. Most of the stuff is actually in my head. I do have computer files, with timelines on them and that I put together over the years, and bits of this and bits of that I can consult from time again. It is sometimes a daunting task. More so nowadays than when I began back in 1991, because the world has become so much bigger and has become so much more complex. In many ways, I followed the template of Tolkien. If you look at Lord of the Rings, everything begins in the Shire, and with the hobbits. And then as they leave the Shire, they get to Rivendell and they meet some more people. They pick up Strider, they pick up the rest of the Fellowship. But then from that point, they start to split up. First they split into two groups, and then the two groups split into three groups, and etc. Well, I followed more or less the same map. I mean, if you look at Game of Thrones, everybody except Dany is together in Winterfell in the beginning. All the viewpoint characters are there. But then they start splitting. And Dany is still off by herself on another continent, but some of my people go to King's Landing, some of them stay in Winterfell, and then the people who go to King's Landing get separated from each other and they go in different. And every time a character goes off on a different tangent, they meet other supporting characters. So at this point, I'm really writing not a novel, but 12 intertwined novels, and each character is in a different place with their own antagonists, their own friends, their own secondary and tertiary characters surrounding them. And yes, that is very difficult to keep in my head. I maybe should have organized it all better when I began back in 1991, but
do you ever...
I never thought it would get to that. I mean, remember, I'd written 4 novels before this: Armageddon Rag, Fever Dream, Windhaven with Lisa Tuttle, Dying of the Light. I never had any problems keeping those characters in my head. I didn't need corkboards or anything. I just remembered it all. I had no idea, though, that when I got into this, that the size that it would eventually become. Fortunately, you know, it's the age of computers. We have search and replace functions, and I can load up, you know, my gigantic file and say, okay, what did I ever say about this character? And I go through. Even then, I make mistakes, and my fans, like you people, and even more obsessive people elsewhere, are always eager to point out whenever I've made a mistake. I have particular trouble with the color of people's eyes. And rather famously, I have a horse who changes gender between the first and second books. It's hard to do a search and replace for the sex of a horse. You know, these errors do sneak in.
Do you ever find you've sort of painted yourself into a corner and you've set up a part of the world that then impedes your storytelling?
Yeah, that is the disadvantage of being a gardener. You know, the architect never finds himself building closed rooms that go nowhere, but the gardener sometimes traipses down a branch and finds himself sitting all the way out at the end, realizing he can't get from that branch anywhere else. So sometimes I do go down byways and say, no, I think I took a wrong turn back like 3 chapters ago. Let me rewrite these chapters, or in one case, or remove these chapters. But I never destroy them. I keep them on my computer in case I see a way to put them in later. There's always that. There's rather famously from the last book that was published, As with Dragons, I had a chapter where Tyrion was moving down the River Royne in the Shy Maid, and I wrote this chapter where he meets a character called the Shrouded Lord, and it's a really good chapter. I mean, I like some chapters more than others. This is a terrific chapter, but it's an absolute dead end. Well, I don't know if it's a dead end, but it introduces like 3 additional layers of complication that I didn't think I actually needed. But I liked it so much, I kept trying to fit it in. You know, at first I presented it straight, and then I said, oh, I can't fit it in. I'll present it as a dream. Tyrion has a dream, and he dreams that this happened to him, and it has portents. And then I split it up into like 8 dreams, and every Tyrion chapter, he dreamed a little bit of it. And finally, I gave up and said, I have to rip out all this stuff. It doesn't do me any good. Someday, maybe when I finish the whole book, I'll publish that lost chapter as a little standalone.
Well, there's a question here from, again, from somebody, I think who may be in the audience, from Crystal Phillips, who says, are there any scenes in A Song of Ice and Fire that you look back on and smile because they were just so much fun to write? I mean, that sounds like one, but it's not in A Song of Ice and Fire. I mean, are there any that you mentioned the first scene with Bran, are there any that really just give you a tingle when you look back on them?
There are certainly scenes that I remember, but they tend not to be the ones that are fun to write. They tend to be actually the ones that are painful to write. I mean, the hardest thing I ever wrote was the Red Wedding scene in A Storm of Swords. And I knew that was coming. I was enough of an architect there that I was building toward that scene. I've been building for that scene since the first book. But when I actually reached that scene, it was too painful to write. I couldn't write it. I skipped over it. It occurs about 2/3 of the way through A Storm of Swords. I skipped over it and I wrote the scenes that follow. I finished the entire book. And I hadn't written that scene yet. That was the last thing I wrote for Storm of Swords. I had to go back and make myself write it. And it's still emotionally, you become very attached to these characters, believe it or not. I know I have the reputation for gleefully killing some of them, but that's not entirely deserved. Sometimes it's very painful for me to kill them. They're my children, for good or ill. So that was a tough scene to write. Yeah. I do periodically enjoy you know, if I write something that I'm particularly proud of, that it really is, that I think is a good piece of writing, that is vivid and evocative, then that gives me pleasure. But it might not necessarily be the scenes that you guys would particularly enjoy. Some of them are just quiet things about, oh, I have to describe this landscape, and I sweat and rewrite it, and I finally get, yeah, this is a great description of three guys riding through a grassy meadow. I've gotten the sights and the sounds and the smells of the scene right to put you there. But it's not necessarily anything that ordinary readers or reviewers, whoever, oh my God, there was such a beautiful description of the grassy meadow on page 314. So, but
At what point did you start to write outside the confines of the Song of Ice and Fire cycle? And I'm thinking here of the Dunk and Egg Hedge Knight stuff, because that seemed, I mean, that was published quite early was that conceived as part of this story that just didn't fit? How did that come about?
that was Robert Silverberg's fault.
Right.
Robert Silverberg decided he was going to do an anthology called Legends, which consisted of original stories. He wanted 10 fantasy writers, each writing a story in their fantasy world, an original story, never before published. And he was offering what was quite a substantial advance, or I think a record advance for a story in any anthology. So, and his lineup was amazing. It was, you know, Terry Pratchett and Stephen King were going to be in this, and Anne McCaffrey, and you know, all of the best-selling fantasy writers. And I was just getting into my series then. I really didn't belong in that number, but I knew that I wanted to be in this book. So when he invited me to be in this book, I gleefully accepted. And then I had to think, well, what am I going to write for this book? I'm still in the middle of writing. I think I was still in the middle of writing Clash of Kings. I mean, the only book out then was Game of Thrones. Well, am I going to write a story about Tyrion or Arya or Jon Snow? No, I can't do that. I have to save that for the book. I have to do this. I have to do a prequel. So I started thinking about my history and what would be a good area to write it, and I came up with the Dunk and Egg stuff. I was particularly attracted. That whole story is built around a tournament, and I love medieval tournaments and reading about them, writing about them. There's of course some of them in the main books, but this was an opportunity in a time of peace, not war, to look at a medieval tournament with all its pageantry and the jousting and the combat, and reveal a little of Westerosi history. And like many other things, it grew. I mean, I gardened it. I started it, and suddenly it was all there. Actually, I was so long doing it that Bob tried to throw me out of the book. I was late delivering Clash of Kings, which everybody knew about, and he was approaching. He'd gotten a lot of money for this anthology, and he wanted to deliver it on a deadline. So all the stories were due at the end of the year on December 31st. And he said, George, I hear you're so late from the book. I can't afford my book to be late, so I'm dropping you from the book, and we're going to replace you. And I said, no, you're not. I have a contract here, and I'm not late yet. You may think I'm going to be late, but I'm not late yet. So you have to keep me in the book. So that's why Legends actually has 11 stories in it, not the original 10. He actually replaced me and found another guy, but I refused to be replaced. And I wrote the story, and God damn it, I got it to him on December 31st, which is at the same time, as I understand it, like 5 other stories came in. So I'm not the only writer who pushes things. And actually, I think that story, that was one of the best decisions I ever made there, was because there was a real jump in my sales figures between Game of Thrones and Clash of Kings. And I think that story in Legends had a lot to do with it. I've had a lot of people come up to me over the ensuing years and say, I'd never heard of you. I bought Legends because there was a new Stephen King story in it, but I loved your story and I started reading your stuff. Or, you know, I'd never heard of you, but I bought Legends for the Terry Pratchett story, and then I read your story, and it was great, and all that. So I think I gained a lot of readers by being in Legends.
Do you plan to do any more of have people here read the Dunk and Egg stories? Yeah. Do you plan to do any more of them? Is this one of the projects at HBO?
I do. I've written 3 to date, and I think I need to write another, I don't know, 9, something like that. But I have pretty well their entire lives in my head. And of course, all those things will become more detailed as I write them. But first I have to finish. I have this book, The Winds of Winter. I have to finish that. And then I can write another Dunk and Egg story. And then I write A Dream of Spring. And then I write another Dunk and Egg story. At some point in there, I have to write the second part of Fire and Blood. So I have my work cut out for me. Why am I talking to you here? I should be home writing.
Well, you know, George, I wasn't going to ask about the Winds of Winter. Tell me about, I mean, you obviously love, or you seem to love, collaboration, world building. Tell me a little about Wildcards, because I know that's a totally different, we've got some whoops, a totally different world that you're building along with other writers.
Yeah, that one actually goes back further than Game of Thrones. I started Wildcards in the 60s, or the 80s, in 1986 or 87, around then. It actually came out of, I'm an old comic book fan. That's how I started, writing letters to Marvel Comics in the early 60s. Dear Stan and Jack, you know. I don't know why Stan Lee printed my letters. It might be because in the first one I said, Shakespeare, move over, Stan Lee has arrived. He liked that for some reason. But I always loved the mythos of the superhero, the person with superpowers. And in the early 80s, with a bunch of my friends in Albuquerque, we were obsessively playing this role-playing game called Superworld. And I don't know how many days, weeks, months, years we obsessively played this game 2-3 times a week till 3 in the morning. But at a certain point, I said, well, this is great, but we have all these great characters, we have all these great stories, and we're not getting any money for them. We have to figure out how to do this and get paid. So I said, it was the 80s. Shared worlds were a big thing then. Thieves' World, if any of you have read that. Leovac, Ithcar, there were a lot of them. But no one had done a present-day superpowers shared world. So we came up with Wildcards, me and a group of friends. And then I reached out and I recruited other writers for it. Roger Zelazny, Pat Cadigan, many. We have like 35 writers in the Wildcard Consortium now. And we've been doing these. I'm the editor, and I've been editing these books. There are like 27 of them in print right now, and at least 2 more originals on the way. And we have 2 television series about the Wildcard universe in the works from Hulu. Hopefully Wildcards will be going for another 30 years. It's a lot of fun to edit. We have some amazing talents and some amazing characters in Wildcards. And we've just published the first Wildcard set entirely in the United Kingdom called Knaves Over Queens, which is the Wildcard world, but from the British point of view. So check that one out. I think you might enjoy it.
Let's move, I suppose, from world building to television. And can I ask how the process of sharing a world with other writers on the page that you've described with Wildcards compares to sharing a world, the world of Westeros, with other creators in Game of Thrones? You know, you might have heard of it, the biggest TV show in the world. You know, what is easy, what is difficult when you suddenly have to open this world out to other writers, other creators, other minds?
Well, there are challenges to it, certainly. You know, when I first got involved in television in the mid-'80s, Twilight Zone was the first show I was hired to write for, and then Beauty and the Beast, and then I had 5 years of development where I was making up my own shows. But remember, I'd sold my first short story in '71, so from '71 to '85, I was active in the world of prose and short stories, books. And that's a very lonely existence. It's, you sitting in front of a computer screen with the cursor blinking and trying to think up something to fill that screen. And before computers, it's you sitting in front of a typewriter, which I did start on back in the beginning and facing a blank sheet of paper. When I first got out to Hollywood, I actually loved the idea of, I'm working with all these other people, and you're in a room, you're on a show, staff, and you're writing things, and then like the next day later, you're in the writer's room, and the other writers are critiquing what you wrote, they're making suggestions, you go back and you rewrite it. You rewrite it maybe a couple times. Other people weigh in, and then eventually it gets greenlit to film, and you're suddenly working with a director. You're casting actors. You're sitting in casting sections, and actors, some of whom you've actually heard of, are coming in and reading your lines, and it's a high. The first story of mine ever produced was Roger Zelazny's, and my adaptation of Roger Zelazny's Last Defender of Camelot, the climax of which takes place in Stonehenge in another dimension. And suddenly, because of what Roger wrote and what I wrote in the script, here's all these people building Stonehenge on a set behind my office. That's a real high. And this social aspect, visiting the set, meeting the actors, working with other writers who are very bright and talented. Going to dailies, coming into your office every day and your assistant brings you a cup of coffee, and you have a script meeting at one point, you have a casting session, you watch the dailies from the previous day's shooting. It's a whole different world than the lonely writer you're sitting alone in is.
Is it distracting?
No, I love much of it. But here's the other side of it. The other side of the same coin is there's all these fucking other people who are telling you what to do. They all have fucking opinions, That they don't like that line, or they say, my character wouldn't say that if they're an actor, or the director wants the scene redone, or the network won't let you do something, the studio said they don't have the money for it. The other writers have different ideas. So the same thing is both very good and very, very bad, very frustrating. There's no, as a creative person, there's no control greater than what you get when you are sitting all alone in front of a computer, in front of a typewriter. You're making up your world. You can do anything you want. You're God. In television, you're sort of a god, but sort of a minor god. There are bigger gods. There are bigger gods above you that can smack you down at any time. So two different ways of telling stories, and both of them have their pluses and minuses.
And so you used to write an episode per season at the beginning you were writing an episode per season of Thrones? Or was that
yes.
the contractual stipulation?
That was I had the option to write an episode per season. Because I knew, going back again to my 10 years in television, I worked on Twilight Zone, did a little bit of work on Max Headroom, but my episodes were never filmed. Then I worked for 3 years, the entire run of Beauty and the Beast. At that point, I'd risen through the ranks in the television hierarchy from staff writer, which was my first position. You know that staff writer is a very lowly position because it's the only one that has the word writer in the title. And then from there, I moved up to story editor and executive story editor and co-producer, producer, supervising producer. And I was set to become an executive producer, a showrunner, which is the big title. But then Beauty and the Beast ended, and then I got a development deal where they're just paying me, studios are paying me money to come up with ideas for TV shows, to come up with ideas for TV movies, feature films, what have you. And I wrote a number of those over the ensuing 5 years. And that can be very lucrative, but ultimately I found it very unsatisfying because nothing was made. They pay you and you have meetings, you get invested in the world, you love these characters, and then they don't make them. Nobody ever reads what you wrote except 4 guys in a room. And I guess I discovered something about myself, that I'm a little like an actor or something. I want the applause, or I want them to throw the rotten fruit at me, but whatever. I want to come out on the stage at the end of I'm done and know that an audience, whether it's the audience in a theater of a few hundred, or whether it's an audience of 20 million on the television sets of America has seen what I've come up with. I wanted that. But at that stage, when I finally went back to books with Game of Thrones, I really wanted to be a showrunner. I wanted to do it and be the captain of the ship instead of just the first mate or one of the swabbies. But then 20 years passed, and by the time Game of Thrones was ready to go to HBO, number one, I was right in the middle of the series. I had 4 books out, and I was struggling to finish Dance with Dragons at that time, and I knew there were 2 more after that. I couldn't, being a showrunner on a television show is a 24-hour-a-day job. I mean, it's a hugely high-stress, busy job. There's crises every day. There's always something to do. It takes all your attention. I couldn't do that without abandoning the books entirely, and that I wasn't willing to do. Books were still number one priority. But I did want to keep my hand in, so I got a contract that said I could write 1 episode per season, and I did in the beginning seasons. But it took me about a month to do each of those episodes, even though they were adaptations, almost in every case, adaptations of scenes and material that I'd already written in the book. So I was just really transferring it from one medium to another. At a certain point, when we got into season 5, the butterfly effect had kicked in, and the show had gotten a little further away from my books, and I no longer had adaptations to do. I would have had to be working on scenes that never occurred in the books and so forth. And at that point, I said, well, it was taking me a month just to do the straight adaptations. Here it's going to take me 6 weeks minimum, maybe 2 months to write these scripts. It's too long. And David and Dan have done a great job. I think I'll step back and just concentrate on the books, and that's what I did.
And given that divergence, how do you now regard what is now the completed sort of corpus of Game of Thrones, the HBO series, within this broad world of Westeros, which you've explored in different directions? I mean, where does it fit in?
Well, it's 2 different ways of telling a story. I mean, I ask people sometimes, how many children did Scarlett O'Hara have? And for those of you who know Gone with the Wind, anybody? Best-selling, most popular movie of all time, and a mega bestseller, of course. In Margaret Mitchell's book, Scarlett O'Hara has 3 children. In the movie, Scarlett O'Hara has 1 child, which is correct, which is right, which is true. True, Scarlett O'Hara had no children because she didn't exist. She was a made-up fictional character. So both of them are equally true. You could do a Gone with the Wind graphic novel next month. You could have 12 children. That would also be equally true. We're making up stories here. So yeah, I'm telling a version in my books, and the show, which had different constraints and different deadlines and different needs, has told a very similar story, close in some respects, exactly the same in some respects, different in other respects.
Let's move from the ridiculous to the sublime and stop talking about television, start talking about history. First of all, I want to ask you about the history of the real world and its influence on your writing of this material about Westeros. Because, you spoke earlier on about turning the map of Ireland upside down. There are very evident sort of influences of medieval history, but not only medieval history on your work. Tell us a little bit about how that's fed into your vision.
Well, I've always loved history. When I was in college, I was a journalism major. History was my minor. And even before college, I loved reading histories, popular histories, and historical fiction. I have thought about writing historical fiction from time to time, about certain periods that I love, but the problem about writing historical fiction is you have to do all this damn research, and you have to you're stuck with the history the way it actually happened, mostly, unless your name is like Quentin Tarantino, and you can make up an end of Inglourious Bastards that's completely different from what the audience expects. But for the most part, you are stuck. I like the freedom of, modeling my books on history, taking taking influences from history, but in fantasy, I can make it come out differently. I can make it take a left turn when everybody's expecting it to take a right. I can do the unexpected and the revelation, and I can make it bigger. I like to say I take things in history and I turn them up to 11. If any of you know your Spinal Tap, you always have to turn it up to 11 or to 27 in the case. So in 1981, Lisa Tuttle and I, my first visit to the UK, I was visiting my friend Lisa Tuttle, with whom I wrote Windhaven, and we took a car and we drove around for a while. One place we stopped was Hadrian's Wall. Had amazing influence on me. We got there just at sunset. Most of the tour bus had left. We pretty well had it to ourselves, and I went up on the wall and stood there and looked off to the north and tried to imagine I was a Roman legionary, in the first century, standing on the wall and wondering what was going to come out of that hills. And, they thought it was the end of the world. Now, of course, I know, being a 20th century at the time American, that what would come out of the hills would actually be Scotsmen. But I thought that could be a more terrifying answer. But that moment always stuck with me. And many years later, when I'm writing what became Game of Thrones, and I wanted a wall, I turned it up way past Hadrian's and made it 700 feet high and made out of ice, and the things coming out of the forest and the hills to the north were a good deal scary, and that's something you can do with fantasy.
Every time that a season of Game of Thrones would be about to come on television in the UK, someone from a newspaper would ring me up and say, hey, we've got this great idea. Can you write an essay about how Game of Thrones is really just the Wars of the Roses? And I'd say, yeah, sure, pay me. And of course, there's a secondary industry in George R.R. Martin material, and I'm part of it. It's not. Clearly Stark and Lannister, York and Lancaster. There are all of these. How much was it drawn from the Wars of the Roses? How much was that sort of just convenient material for you to suck into this world?
Well, there was certainly an inspiration, and probably the Wars of the Roses are the single greatest historical inspiration. But I read a lot of popular history. I also read, the history of the Crusades and the Albigensian Crusade and the 100 Years' War. And, of course, a lot of Nigel Tranter books about the historical fiction about the history of Scotland, which always end badly. The history of Scotland is singularly bloody. If you think Game of Thrones is violent, read some Scottish history.
You draw Scottish history for the Red Wedding, of course.
Yes. The Red Wedding was loosely based on the Black Dinner, as they called it. But of course, once again, I turned it up to 11. And then David and Dan got hold of it for a TV show and turned it up to 14. You can always turn it up a little more.
We've got
the Black Dinner, though, is an interesting case. I say I love history, but I always want to make it clear that I'm not a professional historian. And the histories that I read and the histories that I love are, I guess, what are called popular histories. They're not academic histories. If you accidentally stumble on an academic history, it'll probably put you to sleep very quickly, the stuff that the professional historians do. Now, the Black Dinner of Scotland, I don't know how many of you know that, was there was a enmity between the Earl of Douglas, the Black Douglas as he was called, and the King of Scotland. So he invited the Earl of Douglas, gave him a safe passage to come to the castle and discuss it. And they had a lovely dinner. The Earl, who was young, he was only like 18, 19 years old, and he brought his even younger brother, who was like 15 years old, with him. And they had a lovely dinner with the King of Scotland. And then at the end of it, they started playing this very sonorous beat, and some servants entered with a covered platter, underneath which was a black boar's head, which was the symbol of death. And so then they took the Earl and his little 14, 15-year-old brother out, and they beheaded both of them in the yard. It's a great story, and I went from that and I constructed the Red Wedding. Of course, that's the story in myth and in popular legend, but then if you read an academic historian, said none of that ever happened. No, they did execute the Earl and all that, but there was no sonorous beat, there was no black boar's head. All of that stuff was invented later. And maybe it was, but whoever invented it was a pretty good storyteller, because I like the popular version of it much better than I like the boring academic version of it. I think sometimes in the study of history, there must be someone, maybe he's at Harvard or Yale or at Oxford or Cambridge over here. I don't know what his name is, but his job is to sit in an office and go over history and make it as boring as possible, take out all the fun bits and the colorful bits and make it really dull.
And the rest of us have put them back in.
Yeah.
There's a question here from Laura Ann via Twitter, which sort of connects to this. She says, a lot of your female characters are very empowered and motivated. Which other fictional or historical female characters did you draw inspiration from, if any?
Well, again, there was a lot of them. Eleanor of Aquitaine, of course, was a major one. She was one of the most kick-ass women of the Middle Ages. And, she had her own crusade, or she went on crusade, rather, and she married 2 kings and then was the father of several, or was the mother of several more. She was a great character. There's also a lot of the, if you read the Italian history, a lot of the, during the Italian Middle Ages and Renaissance period, there were a lot of very powerful and bloody women who controlled various city-states in Italy and did some amazing things. There's one very famous story that, again, is probably made up by some popular historian or legend maker, because it occurs in, the same story is told of 6 different men and at least 2 different women, and it's the one where the father and or mother is in a castle, and they have a son outside who they're going to hang. Surrender the castle, or we're going to hang your son right in front of you. And this story is told of William Marshall, the great knight's father, who supposedly pulled up his jerkin or whatever the hell he was wearing and showed them his dick and said, "Go ahead, hang him. I have the equipment to make more." And that same story is also told of, I think, Catherine Sforza of the Italians, where, they were going to hang her son, and she lifted up her skirts and pointed at her vagina and said, "No, I can make another one. See, right here." So probably it never happened at all, since it's attached to 6 people. But God, it's a great story. I can't resist things like that. And don't be surprised if I steal it and you see it in a later Game of Thrones book.
Let's talk about the history of Westeros, because this is your latest book. As I said at the beginning, it's a masterpiece of popular history, and you can tell how steeped you are in the form because of the way you've constructed this book. Tell us why you chose to do this, pulling together earlier writings, I think, on some of them quite substantial, on the history of Westeros. Why put this together now?
Well, as I was writing the books, I would have people think about or refer to things that happened in history occasionally from time to time. And it's actually in the novels, references to dead kings, references to legendary knights and so forth of the past. At a certain point, my publishers said, we want to publish a concordance. We want to publish a world book, because you've got all this history in that. And I was in the middle of writing novels, and I said, yeah, well, that's a great idea. I'd love it. I want it heavily illustrated. I want lots of gorgeous fantasy on it, and I love illustrated books. I always have since I was a kid, reading, Robin Hood and King Arthur books illustrated by people like Howard Pyle and N.C. Wyeth. Gorgeous, gorgeous books. I cut my teeth on those. So I wanted my books done the same way. So, and I said, I have little bits of history in my head that I haven't had an opportunity to put in the books yet, put in the novels yet. But I'll include them too as sidebars. So we hired Elio Garcia and Linda Antonsen, who are 2 of my uber fans. They run the Westeros website, which is the oldest and the biggest of the websites devoted to Westeros and its book. And they were supposed to organize all the historical references that were already in the novels, assemble everything, and write a rough account of it. And then I would go in and I would polish that rough account, and then I would put in these sidebars, which were material that had never appeared. So we were supposed to have 50,000 words of prose, and then the rest would be art on every page, gorgeous art. So by the time Elio and Linda had assembled everything, we already had 70,000 words of prose. And then I wrote 350,000 words of sidebars. And my publisher said, wait, we can't do this. There won't be art at every page. We've already spent the whole art budget. There'll be art every 20 pages. So we ripped out all my sidebars, and we got the book together. It was published a few years ago, The World of Ice and Fire, a very nice book.
Beautiful book.
But then I had all these leftover sidebars that were kind of a history of various Targaryen kings, and I could have written more. I was only like halfway through writing the sidebars when I realized how long they were. So at a certain point, when we realized that Game of Thrones, the TV show, was winding down, but there might be successor TV shows, I said to my publishers, well, we've always been talking about doing this history book, which I was calling the Grimmarillion as a play on Tolkien. Should I finish Winds first, or should I? Because the Grimmarillion is almost complete, at least up to Aegon, the regency of Aegon III. And it includes material in it that is going to be the basis of some of these successor shows. So maybe we should get it out first before the shows. And they agreed, so they said, yeah, they'd finish that one and then go back to Winds of Winter. So I sat down to finish that one. I polished all of the material I'd written. I expanded a few of the sidebars. But then I had to write, there was particularly King Jaehaerys I, Jaehaerys the Conciliator. I'd kind of skipped over him in the sidebars because he was the old king. He reigned for 55 years, and I'd just sort of written 55 years of peace and prosperity. And that was the big hole in this book. And I said, well, I can't just have two sentences on Jaehaerys. He reigned for 55 years. 55 years of peace and prosperity is pretty dull, though. There must have been something that happened during that, and I started inventing all the things that had happened during Jaehaerys' reign, all of his children who were trouble in many different ways, and conspiracies, and the roughness when he first took things, and that expanded too. But I loved it, and I finished all that, and I finally got the whole book done through the regency of Aegon III, and I'm very pleased with it. It's different. I know many of you are getting a copy here as while you were here. It's not a conventional novel. It is imaginary history, written in the style. You've probably read. My real influence on this was Thomas B. Castaing's 4-volume History of the Plantagenets, which. Any of you who have not read, go out and find a copy in the used bookstore. It's wonderfully written. It's full of great stories, most of which academic historians have probably disproved by now. But they're still terrific stories. And the Plantagenets were a family that was equally interesting as to the Targaryens. They lacked only dragons. Otherwise, they would be right up there. So that was my influence, and I tried to do that in this imaginary history book.
Costain is the second best book ever written about the Plantagenets, actually. There are some great scenes. I mean, Aegon's conquest at the beginning of this book, would I be right in saying, a sort of, a version of the Norman conquest of England of 1066, but on dragonback.
With dragons.
Aegon
yes.
the First arriving on Balerion the Dread. I mean, it is just amazing. Is this, can I ask, one of the HBO shows in development? Can you tell us about any of those, by the way? Blood Moon has wrapped something, hasn't it?
I can't.
Go on.
There's probably an HBO agent in the auditorium even now. I can say, as I have said before, we started out with a number of different ideas, all of them prequels. One show, which I've been calling The Long Night, but HBO keeps saying it's not titled yet. So the show that's not called The Long Night yet has just finished filming up in Belfast and is now, and other places, not just Belfast, Italy as well. And Jane Goldman is the writer and the showrunner on that. You've probably been familiar with her work. She was the scriptwriter on several of the X-Men movies. She did Kick-Ass, and she did the Kingsman, both Kingsman things. She scripted Neil Gaiman's Stardust, so she's a very experienced screenwriter. And she's done this story, and it is set, 5,000 years in the past of Westeros, so way, way, way before the events of Game of Thrones. And that's the one that is furthest along at the moment. And it's in pre-production, and right now it's just a pilot, but it's got Naomi Watts in it, starring. It's got Miranda Richardson, a lot of other very exciting actors, and we'll probably be finding out in the next couple months whether HBO is actually going to order the full series of that.
That is very
And
exciting.
meanwhile, we have 2 other pilots that are also in active development at some stage, and hopefully in the near future, one or both of them will be greenlit to shoot a pilot, and we may get more than one Westeros show on the air.
Wow. Do you have any particular favorite characters or episodes within this? I mean, the Dance of the Dragons, of course, it sort of forms, in a sense, a core part of the book.
Well, I have a lot of affection for Mushroom.
Oh, Mushroom. Well, say a little bit about Mushroom and link it, if you wouldn't mind, to the process of writing fake history, because this is something that really struck me, that you've done so skillfully with this book. Explain who Mushroom is, maybe.
Well, Mushroom is a dwarf, and but he's not a well-born one like Tyrion. He's a dwarf of lowly birth who's the fool in the court during the events leading up to and during much of the Dance of the Dragons and its aftermath. He's a jester. There were actually a number of jesters in the real Middle Ages. Of course, you've probably seen them in many movies, fools, jesters, as they were called. Some of them were very, very clever men who could do all sorts of witticisms and jokes, who could sing funny songs, who could juggle and ride unicycles and do other colorful things. Some of them were people who were physically deformed, who were dwarfs or hunchbacks or whatever. And some of them were obviously very politically incorrect these days, but some of them were mentally handicapped, mentally retarded. The people of the Middle Ages found that wonderfully amusing. So Mushroom is a dwarf, but he's of the clever sort. He's an observer, and the testimony of Mushroom. This book's not actually written by me. You see, it's written by Archmaester Gildane of the Citadel, and he's writing a history. And like anyone writing a history, he has to go back to primary sources. And I had a lot of fun with that, because when he gets to the Dance of Dragons, he has a number of primary sources, but 3 of them are most major. He has Grandmaster Orwell's official court records. He has the Septon, who kept the Sept in King's Landing and the Red Keep, who of course is a religious figure. So he interprets everything as the will of the gods and what was a sin and what wasn't a sin. And he has Mushroom, who was semi-literate and couldn't actually write anything, but who told his story in later years to a equivalent of a monk who wrote it all down. And Mushroom's story, of course, is always the most scandalous, scurrilous, filthy version of events, all of which had to do with people betraying each other and poisoning each other and having similar type fun and sleeping in places they shouldn't sleep and all of that. I love the idea, since this was a fake history, I didn't want to tell it as an omniscient historian setting down, this is what actually happened. I love the idea of telling it as a historian in-world who's trying to figure out what happened, but he's looking back at his primary sources, and he's finding contradictory accounts. And this was impressed on me many, many years ago, long before Game of Thrones began. I was writing a novel that was never completed or published. It was black and white and red all over, a novel about 1890s journalism in New York City, when there were 14 competing daily newspapers. One of which was the New York World, owned and operated by Joseph Pulitzer. the great journalist for whom the Pulitzer Prize is named. And the New York World building, which no longer exists, but was down on Park Row, which is where all the newspapers were built, was the tallest building in the world at its time. And it had a golden dome on the top. It was a very memorable building. You know, it was built right next to the Sun, a competing paper, but it was so high that people said Pulitzer could lean out and spit on the Sun if he wanted to spit straight down at the smaller building next to him. The thing is, when I try to research the world and find out tallest building in the world, how many stories was it exactly? I found 3 different contradictory citations. It was easy 20 stories tall, or 16, I think, or 15. And that really impressed on me. This is like 1890 I'm looking at. This is like yesterday in comparable things. This is a simple, factual question. How many stories were in this building? And I'm getting 3 different accounts. If they can't even get that right, what's the odds that they know what happened to Charlemagne, 2,000 years ago or something? The odds are astronomical. So a modern historian or someone like Archmaester Gildane has to sort through these stories, these contradictory stories, and decide which he believes and which he doesn't believe. And I had a lot of fun being able to tell, mushrooms accounts, which are probably all turned up to 37, and then the dollar accounts. But I didn't have to just stick to the dollar accounts. I could give all 3, and that was a great deal of fun.
And Gildane's sort of favorite phrase that he comes back to is, "I guess we'll never know," after presenting every version of the story in this beautifully sort of prurient but kind of buttoned up.
Now, surely when you're writing your actual histories, you encounter the same problem.
It's exactly the same thing. So you do the same thing. You tell the obviously phony version and go, but that's probably phony. But by that time, you've got the bit about the red hot poker up the arse or whatever. You don't, they've make your own mind up, guys. One more question here submitted from an audience member. Aurélie Passy, I think is the name. The 2nd volume of Fire and Blood won't come out anytime soon, so very pessimistic about your output, but maybe with some justification. But could you give us an idea of some elements that it will contain? We go up to the reign of Aegon the Unlucky here. What are the highlights of the putative next volume of this?
Well, I mean, this book only goes up to the regency of Aegon and ends when Aegon III actually reaches manhood and takes control. So I have his reign to cover, which includes the death of the last dragons. Although Aegon III is called the Dragonbane, there are still 3 or 4 dragons kicking around when he takes the crown, and there are none by the time he's over. So that one thing I'm just going to cover why and what happens there, and some of the troubles and rebellions of his reign. And then ultimately his children, who are fairly interesting. I mean, he has ultimately 5, one of whom is Daeron I, the young dragon who conquers Dorne. And he's a 14-year-old Alexander the Great kind of hero king figure. But he dies young, and then his brother Baelor takes over. And Baelor is very religious, he's more of a St. Louis kind of figure. Little extreme in his religiosity, and among other things, he imprisons his 3 sisters in luxurious imprisonment in the Red Keep, the Maiden Vault, but he doesn't like them walking around court because they tempt him with, they have breasts and things underneath their clothes, and he finds that very disturbing to contemplate. So he hides them away. So I'll tell their stories, and I'll tell Baelor's story, and then after him, we get a brief reign of Viserys the Second, and then Viserys' son, Aegon IV, Aegon the Unworthy, takes over, and he's a very colorful figure himself. I obviously drew on Henry VIII for him. Henry VIII had 6 wives. Aegon the Unworthy had 9 mistresses, and they all exist in my head. I know who they all were and what happened to each of them, and who had their head chopped off, and who had affairs, and who did what. So there's a lot of cool material of that. And then you get into the Blackfyre Rebellions, of which there were 5. I've referred to them frequently, so I'll get all the details on the Blackfyre Rebellions. And ultimately, we'll get up to the Mad King and Robert's Rebellion. And
Wow.
That's where I'll draw it to a close. But when am I going to write it? Well, I got to finish Winds of Winter first, and then probably a Dunk and Egg, and then, I don't know. I don't know. I need more hours in the day, and I need to be 20 years younger and all of that. But I'm, you can only write one word at a time, so that's what I'm doing.
Well, George, fittingly, perhaps we're running late, and Sorry. I want to carry on, but I can feel eyes. I do have one more question for you, which is, in this book we have many, many dragons and many, many Valyrian steel swords. And if you could ride one dragon and wield one sword, which would it be?
Well, if I could ride on one dragon, I might as well go with the biggest, which would be Balerion, the Black Dread. He's the mega dragon in this early book. He's the only one that remembers Valeria past a certain point, because he was brought over from Valeria at a little before the doom of Valeria, and he's the biggest and meanest of the dragons that exist. If I could wield only one sword, I don't think it would be any of the Targaryen swords. It would be Dawn, the sword wielded by the Sword of the Morning, the heir of House Dane of Starfall, which is made from the metal from a fallen star. And who knows what magical properties fallen stars bring to Earth.
Well, I think you've got a bit of fallen star in you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we're out of time, so we've arranged for Balerion the Black Dread to take George off to dinner. So George is very shortly going to leave the stage. I'm going to ask all of you not to leave your seats just for a moment, because otherwise Balerion's going to eat you. Wait till we've gone, is what I'm saying. I'm very sorry we have to go, but it has been, I think you'll all agree, an enormous privilege and an utter joy and a pleasure to have with us the one and only George R.R. Martin. Let's have a big hand.
Thank you.